Hey guys, welcome to the Ad Astra podcast, the podcast where we integrate space, policy, and technology. I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
All right, before we forget, make sure to follow us on Twitter at Ad Astra Podcast, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our mailing list on elemental.fm to get regular updates from the team. If you like what you hear, give us a review on iTunes and recommend us on Overcast. So today, for our faithful listeners, we're going to do something a little different. Newton, do you want to sort of explain?
Sure. So as you guys have seen, we've sort of titled our last several episodes after Star Wars themed titles. Episodes 4, 5, and 6, following episodes 4, 5, and 6 of the actual Star Wars movie series. And this episode, we're actually going to call this episode Rogue 1A. Because we're going to be moving away from the typical structure of the show this week due to current events. Now, as many of you already know, the March for Science will be taking place on April 22nd, 2017. And we wanted to spend this episode highlighting the March for Science, what it is, removing any misconceptions about what it's trying to be or what its underlying principles are and why it was started, things like that. So we're naming this episode Rogue 1A for First Amendment, not entirely copying the NPR podcast 1A.
And not entirely copying the Star Wars movie,
yes,
or the Star Wars story, Rogue One.
So the goal is to not get sued by either Disney or NPR. So
I don't know, maybe it might raise our profile.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you know what? Sue us. Actually, sue a gentleman by the name of Jack.
He lives at this address.
Leave me out of this.
You can contact him.
And also, just to give you guys warning, sorry if you hear a little bit of noise in the background. I am talking to you guys live from my recording studio in the Dominican Republic this week. So,
you are not forgiven for that. You are not forgiven for being in the Dominican Republic while we here in the States
suffer through 80-degree weather.
Suffering through 80-degree weather with apartments that don't turn on the air conditioning quite yet.
But yes, I'm on fun employment this week. So, but anyway, back to the main.
Newton starts his new job in 2 weeks.
Yeah, May 1st. So the first week I'll be here in the Dominican Republic, and next week I'll be talking to you live from London.
International Labor Day. You're starting your new job.
Absolutely. That is International Labor Day. Okay. So
let's get started.
Back to the main point of this podcast, the March for Science. And like I said, we're going away from our typical show structure, and we're just going to dive into what the March for Science is and why you should be interested in it. So what is the March for Science? It's comprised of a series of rallies and marches set to be held in Washington, D.C., and over 500 other cities across the world on Earth Day.
Every continent will be represented.
Every single continent will be represented.
Every single continent.
Yeah, so once again, that's this Saturday, April 22nd, 2017. Go to www.marchforscience.com for more information about your individual city. But we would love to also have you guys here or there, in this case, in Washington, D.C. I will be there. Jack will be there in attendance, and as well as many of our Planetary Society cohorts, and other science groups that we are partnered with in the area. So the March for Science is a nonpartisan movement to celebrate science and the role it plays in our everyday lives. And we'll break down the actual goals of the march in a second, but I'll just quickly read through its mission statement. I'll start with that. The March for Science champions robustly funded and publicly communicated science as a pillar of human freedom and prosperity. We unite as a diverse, nonpartisan group to call for science that upholds the common good and for political leaders and policymakers to enact evidence-based policies in the public interest. So that's the listed mission statement of the overall march.
You mean to tell me there are people out there who disagree with this?
Oh, we'll get to that.
I have never heard of anybody disagreeing with the science.
Well, and we'll get to talking about what we'll talk about that word disagreement in a little bit. So just to give you logistics information, because we just keep saying, oh, it starts on April 22nd, figure it out. The march will actually start at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. This is the main march. And it will start at just north of the Washington Monument, and will host a series of scientists discussing their work, having things like teach-ins, and a main stage rally just north of the Washington Monument, sort of like the Women's March on Washington back on January 22nd. And then the march officially begins at 2 p.m. And when we say begins, the Women's March began sometime around that, and it involved a bunch of people kind of standing still because there were so many people there.
And then eventually just getting up and moving across the mall. Yes. I mean, I just remember at the Women's March, it was, we couldn't even, where I was like right smack dab in the middle of the mall. I could see the Air and Space Museum on my right, and I could see the Native American History Museum on my left, and I couldn't hear a single word that was said on the stage, and everyone just kind of started marching in a direction.
Right. I YouTubed the clips that later that day because I didn't hear any of the speeches when we were there.
Yeah, I mean, they were, from what I watched later, they were amazing speeches. It's just the amount of people that showed up,
right,
and that number. I would find it hard for the March for Science to rival the number of people that attended the Women's March, because, I mean, that number is somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million,
right,
in DC alone.
You also had compounding factors as far as attendance for the Women's March. Now, it's been said that this march is more well planned because the Women's March kind of spawned out of the new administration being elected after all of the sexist, quite frankly, things that it said about women. And it only had about a month and a half to form. But one could make the argument that a large number of people that were there to both to either attend the inauguration for an upcoming Clinton administration, for an anticipated Clinton administration, in which case they'd already purchased tickets, and out of the swell of anger that came along with this new administration. So there were a significant number of people there. Now, the thing that this march benefits from is time. People have had time to get together, to organize. This is almost like a 100-day reunion in which we all get together to see. Well, go ahead. What were you saying?
It was a 100-day reunion of the Women's March.
Yes, it's like in some ways it is that, because one of the things that the Women's March spawned was a large number of organizations getting together to have strategic battles with some of the administration's policies, as well as individuals who had never done any organizing or any activism before getting involved. And now we're having sort of a 100-day reunion where the last time the theme was women's rights, the heavy involvement of women in everyday life. That sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but sometimes it needs to be said. And it's shifting gears to just scientists overall, which obviously includes women, but includes a vast number of people who do science and appreciation for science, and the desire to educate the populace about the impact that science has in our everyday lives. And if I don't have anything else on sort of what it is. That's kind of the general overview. So moving right along to who started it, the idea to create a march in general was inspired, like we said, by the 2017 Women's March. And
it was also very much influenced by, as the Women's March was, rhetoric during the last presidential election. But then also, I think it even goes further back than that. I know a lot of people might, critics of the March for Science or critics of organizations participating in the March for Science. I mean, from the Planetary Society perspective, I've seen this a lot, that people see it as, oh, it's anti-administration, when no, this administration is but the most recent in a long line of elected officials who don't necessarily recognize or appreciate science for the economic, technological, scientific, civilian, commercial advantages that it brings with it.
And going back to a point that I made last week, it's not only that, it's the use of the more like the abuse of science and the usurping of science to gain political ground, and only using it for that purpose. That's where it can become dangerous when you wield science.
Using it as a tool to get elected.
Right.
I mean, you have members of Congress and members of state legislatures, I'm sure of both parties, that sort of take advantage of the sort of the scientific illiteracy facing the United States.
Absolutely.
In understanding what hypotheses or theories are, as well as sort of the lack of understanding in what scientific consensus means.
Right.
If 3% of scientists don't agree with something, that means it has to be wrong, that there's enough doubt there to dismantle the whole thing, which just is not true.
Or more so, why those 3%? And that goes back to the experiments, to this discussion that we had a couple episodes ago. The notion.
I think every episode we have a discussion about this.
Yeah. The notion that because you have something that refutes an aspect of an experiment, that doesn't mean that you can. That doesn't mean that you've disproved the entire claim, particularly when you have models that are highly predictive, that reflect reality.
I mean, what these that 3% or 5% or 10% of scientists or academics who don't agree with an established theory or hypothesis, it generally isn't like they just completely disagree with the entire thing. I'm sure there are some that do, but the general idea is that within science, you're arguing over fine points of data. Mm-hmm. You're arguing over variables, not the entire equation.
Right.
Which is what the approach of some politicians and a certain political party seems to have been recently, is that, any scientific uncertainty invalidates the entire process and therefore can be used as a sort of as a rationale for why there's a liberal bias, mm-hmm. or that there's a conspiracy to harm American workers. Or there's so many ways that rhetoric can be used and has been used to elect candidates who just simply don't understand or are willfully ignorant of the facts that climate change is real and science is good for not just a democracy, but it's good for all people.
Right. Yeah. I'm gonna slide us back on track because it's so easy for both of us to just kind of rant about this stuff. So getting back to who started the march, like I said, it was inspired by the 2017 Women's March. And a lot of sources are kind of trace it back to an original discussion on Reddit that then spawned out a Facebook group, to promote an actual march on Earth Day. So several scientists concerned about the new president's policies on climate change, as well as other issues, and also hype from the success of the Women's March, were discussing the best way to respond to what they feared would be and rightfully feared would be an administration hostile to science. And look, just like good science, we're not going to be biased here. The administration has talked about cutting programs critical to scientific discovery here on Earth, such as PACE, which is a program we went over a couple episodes ago. Tune in to episodes 6 and 7, and other Earth sciences programs. So this has caught on so much that major figures within scientific leadership are now co-sponsoring the march. So as far as who's putting this on, we have Bill Nye, which I'm not even going to go into who that is.
Who is that?
Yeah, right. Like you guys know who Bill Nye is.
I've never met him before.
And you also have Mona Hanna-Attisha as well as Lydia Villa-Komarov. These are two lesser known figures, because Bill Nye is kind of as much as I love Bill, he is kind of the big figure on this. But Mona Hanna-Attisha is a pediatrician and a public health advocate who is actually a key whistleblower for revealing the Flint water crisis, letting that be known to both the government and the public. And Lydia Villa-Komarov, she's a molecular and cellular biologist who has been an academic laboratory scientist, a university administrator, and an all-around businesswoman. And she was the third Mexican American woman in the United States to receive a doctorate degree in the sciences. She received that degree back in 1975 and is now a co-founding member of the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. They're the ones headlining the march and serving as honorary co-chairs. And I wanted to bring that point up because one of the big things that this march is talking about is inclusiveness in science. And
which I mean, if you have paid any attention to the rhetoric around science, I mean, women in STEM has been a huge issue. I mean, as long as I've been in school. I mean, this dates probably even well before the 1990s. I mean, inclusiveness and diversity in the sciences to better reflect the diversity of the American and world populace is crucial.
Right.
I mean, if you're, I mean, I think, you know, it might be Bill who said this, and I might be bastardizing a quote, but you know, if you only have men or white men in the sciences, I mean, you're only playing like a third of the bench.
Right.
You know, you're not working at full capacity. I mean, there are millions of people out there with the same capabilities and know-how and intellect as current, or as sort of the stuffy old, you know, old boys club that science used to be. That sort of bringing those new people in is adding a new lifeblood, not only to the sciences, but to science advocacy.
Right. And what we should be doing is figuring out new ways to pull those people in from all of those different and diverse backgrounds, as well as opposed to putting roadblocks in their way, not necessarily explicitly, but implicitly, which result in keeping them away from the sciences. And this actually gets to the next and final topic about the march, which is, why are we marching? And I think this is kind of the biggest topic of discussion as far as the march goes. So I'm just going to list.
Do you got 2 hours?
Right. So
I could maybe talk for even more.
Yeah. So I'm going to go down the list of principles that the folks listed on their site, and basically Jack and I will comment on on each of them. So the first listed principle is that science that serves the common good. So this one's focused on science that's free from manipulation by any special interests. So this one's kind of targeted at organizations like certain oil company scientists who may or may not
and
push for research that states that fossil fuels have no effect or the use of fossil fuels have no effect on climate change.
Them, and then, I mean, you can go back to a prime example of sort of the manipulation of science for the benefit of a special interest. Look at tobacco.
Yeah,
Look at cigarette. What's that movie? Thank You for Smoking.
Yeah,
that sort of parodies that.
Which I love that movie. Which is horrible that I love that movie.
But I mean, that was the reality that people were told that smoking was good for you. Like, I mean, that might be a stretch. I don't think that was everyone.
But it was cool. That was the thing. I mean, that's where Joe Camel came from, right? It was the cool thing to do to smoke, right? And
that the health effects are negligible.
Right.
Like, it doesn't influence, the rate of lung cancer. It doesn't affect respiratory problems. It doesn't affect, the cardiovascular system. But then, the real science came out, and that lobby was defeated, and then hired by the oil lobby. And it is shown. I mean, there's a reason why if any of our listeners do smoke, a package of cigarettes has a warning from the Attorney General, or not Attorney General, the Surgeon General.
Surgeon General. Yep.
I mean, there's a reason for that, and that's from that fight. And we're sort of in the next phase where the same tactics are being used again, of sort of, manipulating the science, manipulating the facts, and all in sort of the guise of benefiting special interests.
Right.
And then in sort of the current case is the oil lobby and the fossil fuel industry. But I mean, it can even go well beyond that as well. I mean, there are, even I could maybe even think parts of the pharmaceutical industry are like this, and especially in the realm of painkillers and addictive medication.
Right. And that's where it becomes tricky, right? Because it's not like every pharmaceutical, company out there is hiring scientists to do this, this evil practice of discovering things that only benefit me. I mean, honestly, I would wager to bet that most pharmaceutical companies are hiring scientists to do science, to do science work, and then pulling those results and obviously marketing them to their benefit, but also using them to produce better drugs and things like that. And it becomes tricky because when there are other groups that may intentionally or close enough to intentionally not necessarily manipulate their results, but only find and publish results that are tailored to that are tailored to something that is that in the overall is not necessarily good for the populace. That's when it needs to be stopped. But this actually gets to a much bigger point, which is government funding of science. When you're talking about science that serves the common good, just in general, doing science, doing evidence-based experimentation and hypothesis testing, identifying new results, and just publishing that information so that other private organizations can do science, or engineers can then take that and use that to build new capabilities. That's science that serves the common good. It's not necessarily for one special interest or the other. It's just results that help humanity. Whether or not they are beneficial or detrimental to any one particular group. So on to the next listed principle.
Yeah, that kind of goes into this this next principle of evidence-based policy and regulations in the public interest.
Right. So,
I mean, that's it seems so simple, right? Yeah. That if you are to implement a policy or regulation, you want to have a rationale behind it. You don't just, I mean, contrary to maybe a somewhat popular belief, the federal government just doesn't sit there and be like, oh, what are we going to regulate today?
Right.
Let's regulate the oil industry again. Oh, let's regulate the farmers. Let's regulate whatever. That's not how that works.
Right.
I mean, there's a reason why regulations are on the books. There's a reason why, regulatory and technical manuals are like as long as they are. I mean, it's just like science. Like it's you have an original theory or policy, and you sort of keep on building on it, and it grows and expands, it becomes more complex and able to react to more extreme circumstances in a better way. And to have evidence-based policy, as someone who studied public policy, I mean, like, that's the prerequisite, is that if you are going to put forward a policy or a regulation, no matter how small or how big it is, you need to have evidence. You need to be able to say there's a metric we can measure. And especially nowadays with everything so data centric, or data driven, maybe not data centric, but data driven, that you need to have a metric that you're measuring against. You need to have a way to measure that, a tool or a survey, and then a way to sort of compare before and after, test subjects, control groups. I mean, there's so many ways that you can test a policy before it's fully implemented.
And I'd love to see that amongst as much policy as possible. I mean, I was gonna hit the data centric point. There are so many ways to convey the way in which you were able to draw a conclusion. The conclusion is typically what's conveyed to the public, but not how you got there. So it comes off to the public as, oh, these guys just had a hunch, right? and they created policy based on. Not saying that's never happened with certain new healthcare bills, but it's better overall. For the discussion that is had afterwards, if the public sees how Congress arrived at a decision, for example, the raising taxes for people who make over 250K or over under the Obama administration, that there are always going to be a group of people who will take that and say, no, we should never do that. There's always going to be another group of people who say, oh, we should absolutely do that, or maybe go further. And then you're going to have this group in the middle, and it's going to benefit you not only politically, but it benefits us as a country, and it benefits the discussion that's had afterwards if you convey how you got to that number, how you got to, let's say, going back to the example of saying that, yes, it's the people that are 250K, who are making 250K or over, who should be paying more taxes, right? Having a method or a medium of conveying that may be what we see over the next decade or two that may be extremely helpful. In fact, that would be that I see sort of a vacuum for that as far as political organizations. It's conveying that point, or conveying that for just modern day news.
Well, and then also to recognize, you have your formula that your policy is. You have y equals mx plus b, and you put plug something in for x, and that's your policy. You need to be ready in case there is confounding variables, z, right, a, q. There's another integral part of policy making is trying to expect the unexpected. Of course, you're never going to be able to expect everything, but there's a reason why a policy implemented in 1 year fails, but then implemented a few years later and it succeeds. I mean, it's all contextual. It's all I mean, like you could have as much money or political clout as you think you do to get some bill passed, but if the economic, political, social, international context isn't right, it's not going to succeed.
But this is bringing it back to science. This is actually bringing the point back to science, because one of the first things that you have to do is define a you have to have a well-defined problem. In most research organizations, the common saying is the problem is the problem. Going out and defining what a problem is, and then creating a well-defined solution is fundamental. Is fundamental to most scientific research. And then when like you were saying, if 10 years later something about an environment changes or a setup changes, you're able to better understand why something worked or didn't work. And effectively what policy should be is problem solving. So
well, yeah, you should. That's the doctrine that was nailed into my head at American University, is that, if you are implementing a policy, it's not that you're going in saying, X policy is better than any of the other ones just because of the way it is. You could go in thinking, and have your sort of slant or your bias towards one option or another. But you have to back it up with reason. You have to back it up and say, well, this is the problem. Mm-hmm. This is how we're measuring the problem. Take healthcare, for example. The sort of really boiling it down. Healthcare is really complicated, apparently. And
who knew?
Who knew? But just on the surface, the problem is not enough people have health insurance. How do we measure that? By the number of people that don't have insurance. And then how do you solve that problem? That's where the problem solving comes in, where you weigh costs and benefits. You come up with alternatives. You look at case studies. You look at other countries that have done similar things, or cities. The amount of federal policy that begins at the local, the city or county level is amazing, because it's, I think it was, I'm really going to go philosophical here. I think it was de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, said, the proving ground of democracy is in the small town. I might be paraphrasing the quote, but essentially, the small town, the municipality, the locality, the county, whatever, or parish, if you're in Louisiana, whatever it is, that is sort of a breeding ground for ideas, because you can implement something on a small scale and see how it works, and then start scaling it up to the state level or to the federal or regional level. But you need to have that background. You need to have a metric. You need to have a problem defined, not just, I want to do X. It's, I want to do X because Y, Z, all these other reasons. You need to have case studies. There's a civic illiteracy too, I think, alongside the scientific illiteracy, that people think that the federal government just sits there and comes up with new rules for no reason. There is a rigid process to do anything in the federal government. There's a reason why laws don't get passed every day. It's a long process. If you have a bill, unless it's you're naming a post office or something, right. But if you have a legitimate bill that it has all these great ideas. Let's take the NASA authorization, for example. That was in the last Congress. That was in the, for the last 2 years, they were debating that.
Yeah.
And still now, they just recently passed it, but it's gone through so many iterations and so many different changes. And still, it didn't really even do much, because it didn't allocate any money. But it's that first step in defining a problem, reorganizing national priorities. There's so many things that policy can and can't do. And the focus of your policy changes depending on what problem you're trying to solve. For the authorization, there isn't really a problem. It's more of a prescriptive than sort of solving an existing problem. It was trying to prevent the problem of the reset of the space program. But I can go on this for hours. So let's
say we got a few more. Let's hit the last few. So cutting edge science education. This is something that those who know me have heard me preach about multiple times. So
and I think that one could kind of go in sort of in the same vein as diversity and inclusion.
So yeah,
and STEM.
let's just a quick on the overall, because I see why they separated it. So the part of the reason they separated it, science is not a field that should be understood by a select few. And now, yes, that does include that does to some extent include diversity and inclusion, but it's pulling down this notion that there aren't there doesn't exist this group of people who are just destined to be scientists, such that everyone else has zero involvement in science whatsoever, and that elite group of scientists just handles the advancement of science for all of humanity. Science is something that we should all have a at least basic understanding of, and such that we can see how certain policies are, how certain policies impact us when they are, particularly when they are based on science. That goes to things like climate change, which you've heard us rant about. That goes to things like vaccines, GMOs, so on and so forth. And part of this is rooted in this notion that there are just people who are bred to be scientists, and there are just people that aren't, which is just categorically false, right? And most psychology studies have identified this notion as false. That whole notion of a math brain versus a reading brain, and bisecting
like the left brain versus right brain thing.
Yeah, all of that research has been thrown out the window, like in the last, I think, decade or so. In reality, it's really finding a particular field of science that you're passionate about and going after that field that pulls you into the sciences. And often when people don't go into the sciences, it's because they're not exposed to that particular subfield. If people think that all of chemistry is only this way, or all of physics is only this way, often, and this is often inspired by high school teachers, quite frankly. Having a good bio teacher, having a good chem teacher, having a good physics teacher will inspire people to go into bio or chem or physics after a while. But if people see that they didn't have any interest in that class, or even worse, that they did bad in a particular class at that young stage, while they've seen other groups of people advance, it typically deters them and makes them throw up their hands and say, I'm not good at science.
Well, and then there's also the cultural side of it. I don't know how many times I've seen a cartoon or something where it portrays science as something difficult, like as if it's like inertly something that not a lot of people are good at.
So this is, and that's part of what influences this, is that if I am a middle schooler or a junior higher, and I see someone in class, let's say I'm in the middle of my math class, and I see someone in class raising their hand continuously, constantly just getting what the teacher is saying, things like that, I would typically lean towards thinking that, oh, I'm just not good at this, and that person is. When in reality, often what happens, I'm not saying this is 100% of the case, but often what happens is that person's parent, I would say 8 times out of 10, is a scientist already. And that person has been raised with a mode of questioning, a mode of being critiqued that just not everyone has to go through. I mean, when you walk into most places in the government, most scientific labs, if you ask people to raise their hand if their parent was a scientist or engineer or something related to the sciences, most people's hand will go up. And that's not something that a lot of people realize, much less children. So when children see something like that in the classroom, they will see that and go, well, okay, that is the person who's good at science. I am bad at science. When in reality, what it takes to go into the sciences in general is finding something that you're passionate about, and having being able to find a way, and this just takes practice, not whether or not left brain or right brain, find a way to understand the language of mathematics.
Well, I mean,
and that just comes through practice. That's nothing else but
it's saying that
practice.
science is a method. It's not. I mean, we talk often about how there's a like a human need to explore and to understand. Well, there is, but it's not like you're born, or some people are born and they just know the scientific method off the top of their head. I mean, it is a refined, learned process that you have to go through. And if you're brought up in that environment, or surrounded by questioning things, by trying to follow a logic train.
Well, yeah, more along the lines of logic and reasoning. If from birth you are criticized whenever you bring about a logical fallacy, and it is well defined to you what that logical fallacy is, you're much less likely to use logical fallacies, and you're more likely to identify logical fallacies in everyday life. And that applies to everything, but it's particularly highlighted when you're doing science and when you're in the science classroom. So,
well, I know Neil deGrasse Tyson talks a lot about this, about why, the problem is, and I'd agree with him in part, that the problem is that students and kids don't learn to question, that the education system as it is so focused on rote memorization and test scores, and the educational system is so much more data centric than I can't think of anywhere else that is so focused on your test score and not what you're learning on a day-to-day basis, that students sort of don't get exposure to the scientific process, the process of asking questions, coming up with hypotheses, questioning, the logic, questioning the rationale, like having a critical understanding of the universe and of education is not something that is widely taught.
Well, I'll take it one step further than Neil. Being taught to question things is well and good. And I actually think that at this point, it's become sort of a mantra. It's almost a slogan at this point. No, question everything, question everything. It's not necessarily the fact that you question something. It's how you question it. Are you questioning it in a way that is interesting? It's good for a bar conversation? Or are you questioning it in a way that is going to lead to the founding of a new result, that will lead to finding new information, producing new information that you and the people who are also questioning this thing have not seen or thought of before. That's the biggest problem, because there are plenty of things we can question, right? People question things like smart meters on their house, right? Like people go, "Oh, well, is this smart meter going to give me cancer?" And then they fund massive campaigns about those sorts of things, which is just ridiculous, right? Right? It's backed in no scientific founding, but people think it's an interesting question, and people use pseudoscience to kind of back it up. When in reality, the type of questioning that you're doing should lead to some new result, some new piece of information. And that's effectively what conducting research and experimentation entails. So let's continue going. This was going to be a half-hour episode.
Yeah, right. We didn't even get to the big topic.
Yeah,
for later.
We're it's a strap in. The next principle for the March is diversity and inclusion in STEM. So,
and I sort of mentioned this a little earlier about not playing the full bench, right?
Right.
Like that's sort of where my understanding of why we need diversity and inclusion, but also as sort of as an inspiration to students. I mean, everyone knows who Albert Einstein is, right? you grow up, it doesn't matter if you know E equals MC squared, what that even, what even general relativity is. But Albert Einstein, the famous equations, you get that. But if if you don't look like Albert Einstein, you don't see yourself becoming as prominent or as famous or as intelligent as him.
No, I think that's a good point.
My thought process behind this.
I think that's a good point. And you're seeing a lot of things, sort of in popular culture, even reflecting that. Just to kind of get into a little bit of nerd talk, Marvel's all new, all different line is focused on having minority superheroes that you've just never seen before in any other respect. Spider-Man is black. Miss Marvel is a young Pakistani teenager, and it's giving people these sort of heroes that they'd never seen in any other. Well, that they could never picture themselves as, because the norm was always in superhero, particularly in superheroes, was always white, right?
The default for superheroes was it's a white man. I mean, it's Superman. That's the default.
Absolutely, and the same thing works in a lot of different aspects of life. People are, and I don't know what this is probably part of just sort of our inherent tribalism as humans, but people will tend toward fields, occupations, things like that have people that look like them. I'm not saying that's a universal law, but it is what people tend to do. Particularly if they have a common background. It's a significant contributing factor. But going back to a point that you made earlier, I think this is the bigger point, is that, effectively what you're talking about is that science works best when it comes from people of all different backgrounds, because whether you want to believe it or not, someone as a woman has a different perspective from which to view problems than me as a man, right? I, as a cisgender black male, have a different perspective from which to view problems than Jack, you as a cisgender white male, right? And we both have different perspectives than a cisgender gay male or lesbian, and it's because of our backgrounds. And I'm sorry if I butchered any of the gender language out there, but it's still fairly new to me and I'm learning. All right.
That's understandable. Yeah. I mean, that's the concept is what.
Yeah, the concept's important
at this point.
Don't yell at me about it. Once again, send all complaints to @JackCrowd.
Hey.
But the point is your background shapes how you view things, whether you like it or not. I have experiences that other people just don't have as a black male, and other people have different experiences than I do. And that all impacts the way that you look at problems in science. I know we talk a lot about the scientific method, but individuals bring their own methods or thinking for solving problems that will just inherently be used. And that
contributes to cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
And your inert biases.
Right.
I mean, it reinforces that if you are in a if your field is monocultural, if everybody that you go to work with looks exactly like you're not being exposed to a new series of experiences. Yes, I mean, you're not going, it's not like was that movie, the Stepford Wives?
Yeah.
Where everybody just looks the same and they're just clones or whatever it is. I mean, people do have, I mean, even within the same racial or gender grouping, like they can have different experiences between them. I mean, there's so many layers. I mean, that's why it's, a lot of these we use the phrase intersectional, that there's all of these sort of areas intersecting in in what you are as a person.
Right.
So you could be, a white man, cisgendered man, but grow up socioeconomically disadvantaged and have a completely different experience than someone who looks almost exactly like you but grew up wealthy.
Right, and this is one of the biggest things when it comes to diversity in general, is just missing out, right? Like that's one of the biggest lessons that you can learn from movies like Hidden Figures, for instance, right? For those of you who haven't seen Hidden Figures, it's about the famous mathematician Catherine Goebel. And it's about basically her figuring out some of the orbital trajectories to get Glenn into orbit and have him land, right? It was amazing. It was an amazing portrayal. And Catherine Goebel is an amazing woman for it. But the big lesson, like her big victory within that movie was, her being able to figure those things out, right? And her just showing up in her showing up like the white establishment, right? That was kind of the overall tone. But the big lesson or takeaway of that movie, what it was to me, and I don't know if this was intentionally conveyed by the director or not, was what if she slipped up along the way, right? What if she made any of the mistakes at the points at which she could have in that movie, right? There were a million points where the quote unquote white establishment kind of pushed her into a corner in order to make a mistake to say you're just not up to snuff. And she would have been canned. And if that had happened, what would have happened to John Glenn? Right? Like think about that for a second. Like a fundamental part of the space race could have been crushed by just sort of this by this sort of institutionalized racism. And once again, it would have been that classic excuse of, well, I guess she just couldn't cut it, or she just doesn't have what it takes to be NASA caliber, which is often used on women and minorities in the field. It just is. And when when in reality, she would have just been it wasn't that she would have been cut for not being up to snuff. She would have been cut for not being perfect. Right, because she wasn't Superwoman. And when there are tons of, and I'm sorry, but there's no better way to say this, mediocre white males who fly through the field, who can fly through without being half as good as someone like Catherine Goebel, like that's where this could become a problem. And I don't want to rant on that too long, but inclusion and diversity, it enriches science and it helps us to not miss out on particular opportunities. Yeah, good.
Yeah. If you want, the listener, if you want to learn more or discuss this further with us, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, because it's a major issue, and it's something that people as a cisgendered white male, I don't always understand and always looking to learn more. But it's a conversation. It's a tough conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Right. And then let me be clear, just to clarify my earlier statement. No way am I saying that like every white male who makes it is just mediocre, but you're hard pressed to find mediocre women and minorities in positions of power. Okay, that's more so the point. Whereas you can be president of the United States. All right. Anyway, we're talking science. I'm not gonna.
All right. The last two reasons that we're marching.
Yes.
Do we want to combine them or do lightning round for both of them? Because we're hitting it out.
So I actually like the first one honestly a lot more than the second one. So I'm just gonna kind of go on about that one. I'll read the second one first, which is funding for scientific research and its applications. To me, it's a bit redundant of the first one. So we'll just go into that. Which is open, honest science and inclusive public outreach. And this is what they call the no more gag rules principle. And to give you an example of this, when Obama took office in 2009, EPA and other energy agencies were finally permitted to release an entire suite of climate change technical papers that had been suppressed by the Bush administration because of their political standpoint on climate change. And that's not how this should work, quite frankly. Papers shouldn't be released based on what administration is next. If there were papers that were created based on research and experimentation during the Obama administration that said climate change isn't real, that needs to be published, right? Right. And this is the flip side of this. Science works by releasing findings and having the experts in that field critique them, both through peer review and the sheer act of publishing. One of the best papers to write is one that refutes someone else's findings. All right. And people get giddy over writing that kind of stuff. And the fact that,
well, yeah, I mean, because you're telling someone that they're
right,
wrong.
Exactly. Like
it gets, you get all excited.
Yeah. It's amazing.
But you're right. I mean, like science should not be this political tool. And this kind of goes back to something I said really early, that this administration is not the first incidence of anti-science rhetoric influencing government policy. I mean, you just mentioned the Bush administration having a gag rule on the Department of Energy and the EPA. I mean, you have this happening. You've had this happen over the course of millennia. I mean, look back to Galileo or Copernicus. You know, when they questioned the order of things, and the government or church at the time, you know, said, "Well, we're going to put a gag rule. You're under house arrest. We're making sure your paper or book does not get published." I mean, it's coming from the same point of view that, you know, that science can be dangerous to the existing social order or the existing, at least in I guess maybe more modern times, the existing economic order is the big threat that especially climate change research has an impact on. I mean, if those reports had come out earlier on climate change, if they had actually come out during the Bush administration, I mean, imagine where we could be.
Imagine
now
the world we'd be living in. In terms of green energy, right?
Like we could be 10 years ahead of the
which
curve.
Funny enough, the military was researching green energy that entire time because it reflected the truth that you needed these capabilities anyway. Yeah.
That's what I love about the Department of Defense is they can do basically anything they want, and when Congress questions them, they just say it's for national security. We can't tell.
I'm gonna miss it.
And Congress just shuts up, and they're like, "All right, here's your money. We don't want to know anything else about it."
Yeah,
like you said, you said NS, you know, you said national security. Like we can't. We're not messing with that.
But at the end of the day, you don't have to gag scientific discovery. Scientists are always, once again, they're chomping at the bit to refute research. And quite frankly, if something like climate change were definitively and completely disproven in a report tomorrow, it would be It would be three things. It would be shocking, scary, and thrilling. It would be shocking because so many of our models say it was happening, right? That would freak everyone out, right? It would be scary because the results that we'd have gotten over the last 40 to 50 years said that this dangerous thing was happening to our environment based on our own activities. And now there's something that has completely disproven it. So, you know, should we be freaked out? Should we, is everything okay? That question would be up in the air. And then third, it would be thrilling because now we have to go back and figure out, okay, how did our models give us this answer that we've been getting, even though we were wrong? That's an entirely new research area. So that whole notion of, they're doing it because they want continued funding, that's a moot point. Like they
don't care. They're going to be doing research on it regardless. I mean, there's going to be funding for it. I mean, they're scientists. Their job is to do science. Right. It doesn't matter what it is they produce. They're there to perform the process and produce results, produce papers and books and speeches and TED Talks and all that. I mean, show me that paper when it comes out. If you do not accept climate change, find me the paper that completely refutes it and is scientifically recognized.
Absolutely.
Because it's not out there.
Absolutely.
It is not out there.
Absolutely.
Now, if it comes out tomorrow, you can, I'll admit I was wrong, but that's not going to happen.
So let's move. So I do have one more thing to say about the march, but I'm going to do it after our coming soon to space section. So Jack, What's coming soon to space?
So last week in Orlando, Florida, I'm sure every podcast has made mention of this. I mean, you're probably listening to Pod Save America, and they've probably already mentioned it. I haven't listened to the most recent episode, but Star Wars. Come on, The Last Jedi. The teaser came out. It's like, wow, it's so good.
Oh my god!
I've watched it. Like, so Newton, while you were updating Windows 10 before we started
the
recording,
pre-show, yeah,
I watched it 4 times. It's 2 minutes and 21 seconds long. I know exactly how long it is.
I feel like I watched it. I feel like I watched a movie every time I've seen it. Like I can sit down and just say, I'm going to watch Star Wars teaser trailer today.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
There's so much about it, and there's so much that I'm thinking about with it, and almost how sort of something I was thinking about. And maybe this could be a discussion for our friends over at the Beltway Banthas. Shout out to them, or a conversation for a later episode. But how do the bad guys, or maybe not the bad guys, the troops in white, the clone troopers, stormtroopers, and the First Order stormtroopers, how do they exhibit or exemplify fears of the time? Was something I thought about. Think back to stormtroopers. I mean, in the original trilogy, you have the sort of, it's the mega state. It's the big brother state. That was the big concern throughout the late 70s and 80s. You get into the prequel trilogy, with all its flaws, but it's canon, so we have to talk about it. Clone Troopers, I mean, they exemplified sort of, where is science and medicine going? I mean, like, I remember that was around the time that, cloning sheep started to become a thing. I mean, and it sort of played on those fears. And they were the, quote unquote good guys, but like, you saw them sort of take over. And then now you have the First Order, and you have sort of, and with Luke's ending line, it's time for the Jedi to end.
I don't know what that means.
Like you see the First Order as maybe they're like what fear are they espousing? Like what? I don't know. That's an idea I had. I feel like I'm yammering on about it, and it doesn't make any sense quite yet, but I have a theory on that.
What's your theory?
But like, I don't have it. It's not complete yet. It needs to go. It needs to undergo testing. But the Jedi to end that line. Yeah. So I thought the whole trailer was great. I'm sitting there watching it. I'm on the computer, and I'm like sitting there, and I'm like freaking out, and it's like, oh, this is so cool. It's so cool. And it's like, okay, I'm getting hyped up for it. And then that line hits, and I'm speechless after that.
Yep. No.
I don't know. What was your response?
I mean, the line hitting, honestly, my whole thought during, no, that's really when this thought hit me was, this looks amazing, and I have no idea what they're doing. Like,
that's the thing. It's so unpredictable.
That's what gets me about this trailer is like, I am so jacked to see this movie now, but I have no clue what it's about. Right? Like, I mean, I have speculation.
Like, when you're watching the original trilogy, you know that the good guys are going to win, and you know very clearly who the good guys are. When you're watching the prequels, you know the bad guys are eventually going to win. Like, you know how it plays out. And then sort of in The Force Awakens, you're like, well, they already said that there's 2 more movies coming out. Like, the good guys have to win
Well,
somehow. Oh, look, they just have a bigger
they have to
Death
get
Star.
knocked down, and then they have to have their comeuppance. Is really what I'm kind of expecting. And the title, The Last Jedi, leads me to believe that there is going to be some major event. I think more than even just a death, right? I mean, the death is, I think, what everyone is predicting, but I think there's going to be some major table turning event that I mean, I don't want to get too deep into this, but leaves, and this is potentially where this line came from, leaves even Luke or our heroes to question their own morality, which is far more intense than just a death, or it can be if it's executed well.
That there's something bigger.
Yeah.
I'm gonna we need to link that meme.
Yeah.
That you shared, and I got tagged in as well. Where it's the old picture of Luke Skywalker, or not the old, like the young Luke Skywalker, young Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker, and then old Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker. And it's on the left, it's the optimistic, liberal, reformist college freshman who believes in the Jedi Order, believes that like you can bring justice back to the galaxy and everything. And it's like verse on the right. You have radicalized anarcho-Marxist retired professor Luke Skywalker.
I was like, this is too real.
I just can't wait. I can't wait for the philosophical discourse on The Last Jedi to come out. Like, I'm maybe more excited about where The Last Jedi could take the philosophy of Star Wars more than the actual.
I know, and like I felt so nerdy for thinking that until I talked to you about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, like the Star Wars lore is like amazing to me, and it's so cool because they hint at gray Jedi or non or Force users that don't fall within the Sith Jedi paradigm. They mention that in the Clone Wars, and they mention that in Rebels, but they have never really mentioned that anywhere else. But like those are the newest sources of canon.
Yeah,
that like we gotta kind of take that as the major theme maybe coming at us. But then also, I have a couple questions. Where is Snoke?
Right.
Are we going to get like a flashback to the destruction of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy?
I think so. I think
was Captain Phasma involved in all of that? That's what it looked like. But like that could also be some clever editing.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing with Disney trailer. I'm always cautious of Disney trailers, especially after Marvel Civil War. With the whole, spoilers, Spider-Man being in the main airport scene of Marvel Civil War, but him actually being spliced out of the trailer. They over at Disney, and particularly at Marvel, but just Disney in general, are so good at cutting a trailer that gives you the exact emotion that I talked about earlier, just to bring it full circle. Whereas I am so jacked to see this movie. I cannot wait to see this movie. I have no idea what it's going to be about.
Well, because if it follows the same formula as Episode 5,
there's speculation all over the place, but no one has any idea what this movie is actually about. and that's what's great about it. Like, it's going to leave people like podcasting about it like we're doing right now, where we're talking about all these things that are going to happen in this movie, and in reality we just have no clue. And I'm so excited even for that, because that makes it even more thrilling when we go and see it. And that's why they make billions every time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'm gonna contribute to that billions of dollars within the first week. Like I'm gonna see that like every day for the first week.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But I guess maybe my last question about The Last Jedi. Ryan Johnson, if you are listening to this podcast, please answer my question. Why do we hear Obi-Wan and Yoda?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we getting Force Ghost? Because I was so looking forward to that in Force Awakens.
No, I'm glad they didn't do it in Force Awakens, actually. But go on. Sorry.
So it made sense that they didn't do it there, because none of the characters knew that they were part of this whole trilogy thing or this whole story. the Skywalker saga. Like they didn't know that they were part of that.
Right.
I mean, of course, if Luke had a bigger presence in Force Awakens, or if the plot was a little different, I could see them throwing it in. I remember there was the idea of having Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader be a Force ghost that appeared to both Rey and Kylo Ren, but to Kylo he'd appear as Darth Vader, and to Rey he'd appear as Anakin, and you'd see this sort of torn side between them. I remember that was something that was apparently an idea. But Last Jedi, I really just want to see Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I'm down for that.
Again.
I'm down for that.
Or at the very least, I want an Obi-Wan Kenobi movie. Which would... All right, I think we talked too much Star Wars. We will link that meme in the show notes. I think the only things we're linking this week are the March for Science information
and Star Wars.
And Star Wars.
Okay,
I think that's a good week, and we're still over an
hour. We're still over an hour.
Episode.
All right, this last point will take just a couple minutes, just 2 or 3 minutes. But this kind of gets to the heart of why I wanted to actually name this episode Rogue 1A. Was when I was looking over the principles for the march at www.marchforscience.com, as well as the goals for the march itself. And listed, there's several goals from the march, but listed as the final one is to affirm science as a democratic value. And that one actually hit home for me. To have this be a fundamental part of democracy. So, and now the Declaration of Independence is not law, but it is part of sort of the moral fiber from which this country was liberated. And one of its major clauses, which is well known to everyone, is we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men and women. I added that in there. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are suffered than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. And this is the key here. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. This march, the March for Science on April 22nd, 2017, tells the government, it tells the general populace, it tells U.S. scientists, it tells scientists worldwide, it tells governments worldwide, and it tells the people of the world that there is an American presence that will hold its government accountable for slighting science, even in the most minuscule of ways. We condemn any administration, Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, for the distorting, abusing, or usurping of science strictly for their political needs. We view that as a government that we do not support, as one that we wish to throw off, and one that the world cannot afford. To quote Kennedy, and I'm going to finish it with this quote, "All mankind waits upon our decision. The whole world looks to see what we will do. We cannot fail their trust, and we cannot fail to try. We have some of the strongest science right here in the United States. And on this Saturday, April 22nd, we need to get together and stand up for it."
Mic drop.
Mic drop. And on that note.
Wow. So I guess I'm not going to attempt to rile the troops because I think you've already done that. I just want to say, if you plan on coming to the March for Science in Washington, D.C., meet at the Federal Triangle Metro stop at 9 a.m. on Saturday, April 22nd. I will be there. Newton will be there. We'll be with the Planetary Society. There will, from what I can tell, there will be hundreds of people, at least at that metro station. And we will march for science. I mean, I can't say anything more than Newton already has on the importance of science for our democracy, for the world, for the security of our species.
Let's get out there and treat it as it should be. Treat science as it should be.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, as always, follow us on Twitter. I don't even think I need to go through the whole thing because if you are listening to this, you better be at the March for Science.
Yeah.
And if you're not in the DC area, go to a sister march, go to marchforscience.com. There is a tool you can use to find the nearest March for Science. There's 517 marches. You're going to find one. There's going to be one near you. I mean, you could be in Antarctica and there's going to be a March for Science. I'm telling you that. Go support science. Call Congress too.
Call your Congress people.
We have to also make sure that this doesn't end on April 22nd. That if the abuses of science continue, we will continue a persistent scientific revolution against the established order.
And I'm here for it.
Against the first order.
Just the first. We're not getting you on Star Wars again. Anyway, on that note.
We're getting, all right. Anyway, as always, I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton. Ad Astra.